Are tariffs creating supply chain havoc? Well, joining us today to speak about that, Kit Conklin, Global Head of Risk and Compliance at Exiger. Kit, it's great to see you again.
Thanks for having us.
No surprise that lots of tension going on these days over tariffs between the United States and China. I guess the question, though, is this. How is that turbulence influencing supply chain strategies, and particularly in two industries, in pharma and in semiconductors? So walk us through that.
It's affecting nearly every aspect of supply chains, and in particular, pharma and semiconductors are being affected perhaps the most. And that's because the United States has launched so-called reciprocal tariffs against China, amongst other countries. But in addition to those reciprocal tariffs, they've also launched sector-specific investigations on those two product categories. And these are nuanced. They're called Section 232 tariffs, and that enables the president to really dive deep into those supply chains for national security purposes and apply additional tariffs to those products as well as their derivative products. So think about how complex that could be, right? If you're an industry and you're trying to map out and understand where your tariff exposure is, think about how many semiconductors are in every type of product imaginable, right? And those derivative products now are being affected by these tariffs in a way that they've never been experienced by.
Well, so when it comes to sourcing and manufacturing strategies, clearly the people have got to be sitting around saying, we've got to adjust in order to be able to deal with this. If we're going to have a truly resilient supply chain, we've got to make some adjustments. So if you were advising them, what would you tell them? What do they need to do? How do they need to proceed?
You have to think about where the geopolitics of the moment are, right? And there is bipartisan consensus in Washington right now that there is an over-reliance on China for certain types of products. These include pharmaceutical APIs, for example. 90% of APIs that the United States imports for pharma are derived from China, right? That's a national security risk that both Democrats and Republicans in Washington believe should be addressed. And so if you're a company and you're trying to think through, well, tariffs are on again, they're off again, if you really dial this back down to the policy itself, these are sticky and they're not going anywhere. This is a national security issue for many of these sectors, and it's only going to grow. Another example is critical minerals. So China has announced rare earth and critical mineral bans for US companies to acquire those goods. And subsequently, the United States has announced another 232 investigation into tariffs related to critical minerals and their derivative products. This will affect millions of products and SKUs around the world immediately. And so if you're a company trying to build resilience, if you don't know where that exposure is, there's no way to figure out how to be resilient. You need to figure out where that exposure is before you can figure out a way to mitigate that risk.
Well, we've outlined then what the challenge is. The question is how to proceed going forward, because this is not the kind of thing that you, like the pharma APIs that we're talking about. You cannot just uproot this and move this overnight. This is a complex, time-consuming operation, is it not? So what do you do?
That's right. And think about the same thing for mines, right? It will take a decade for a new mine to come online to address some of the policy discussions that are happening in Beijing and Washington now on critical minerals. This isn't going to be solved overnight. So how do you reshore in a way that makes sense from a commercial perspective, right? And so I think that's where you're starting to see industry take a 1+1 approach to geopolitical related risks. So for example, instead of being totally reliant on China, they're now going to diversify their supply chains to be China plus India or China plus Brazil or China plus somewhere else. And we're seeing that across every possible industry vertical. Now that doesn't absolve all of the tariff risk, of course, but it certainly lowers that geopolitical heat that you're going to start to see from a regulatory and compliance perspective.
So if I were to come to you and say, look, I need basically a list of best practices. I need to know what I need to know. Is this the kind of advice you're going to give me? Anything else?
If you're trying to figure out what to do next, you can't really do that unless you know where you're at right now, right? So if you haven't invested in ensuring where your supply chain is fully mapped out, then you're not going to know where your exposure is and you're not going to know what to do next. That's the first step. Otherwise, you're flying blind.
I want to turn to AI because, of course, it's always top of mind right now in these days when we're talking about supply chain. AI-powered risk management. Let's talk about the role that has in multi-tier supply chains, et cetera. What do you say? Walk us through that. What's going on there?
Supply chains are very complex, right? We recently at Exiger completed a supply chain illumination for the F-35. If you think about the F-35 and how complex the F-35 is, it's one of the most complicated supply chains that's ever been assembled. Dozens of countries, hundreds of companies, and then if you try to figure out where did that raw material come from the dirt, right? The minerals or the components that ultimately make up that F-35, we were talking about millions and millions and millions of data points. Humans simply cannot handle that much information. They can't do anything with that much information. You have to run AI on top of that data to figure out where the risk is and how to scale this out, right? And so if you're sitting as a supply chain procurement officer and you've got an Excel file and you're only thinking about how do I do supply chain mapping and how do I create a resilient supply chain, and you're only thinking about this from an Excel spreadsheet perspective, you're just not going to be able to identify where that risk is at scale and with the speed through which AI can now deliver that.
So if you're looking to identify and mitigate those risks, it's just impossible without that particular type of technology is what you're saying.
That's right. Think about where AI was in 2020, right? And COVID, ChatGPT wasn't a thing, right? And 2 years later, 3 years later, it's now not only been launched, but it's now become integral for nearly every aspect of industry. And as we think about AI in 2028, 2029, the technology that's available today is only going to grow and scale to the extent that supply chains can be run almost autonomously, if that's what a company desires to do. And the reason why that will save time and money for industry is because it will lower costs. You'll be able to identify alternative suppliers in real time. That's something that humans can't do. AI is what's going to enable folks to do that.
So it is a reality. It is more and more a reality for people in the supply chain if they're looking to succeed. Kit, this is valuable information, but I don't want you to get away before we say a little bit more about Exiger itself. You mentioned the F-35, but just give us an idea about the focus of the company overall. What does it do? Who are you?
Exiger is the world's largest supply chain mapping company. We are the U.S. government. We are the primary government supply chain mapping capability. But we also work with hundreds of corporate clients across every industry vertical to identify where supply chains go, right? We can take tier ones and we can map that down to the raw material and the hole in the ground. The only company that's able to do that, right? And so what enables us to do that is proprietary technology. It's that AI that enables us to do at scale what individual companies simply cannot do. And so we're able to provide that value add for our customers through combining intelligence analysis with policy expertise, having conversations with the White House, having conversations with members of Congress on these issues, and building that policy expertise and that intelligence expertise into a product that delivers results for our clients.
That is truly interesting, I must say. Good work that you're doing there. Listen, I know you're busy here at the conference. You found time to speak with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's Kit Conklin, Exiger, speaking with us today about tariff turbulence and other uncertainties in the supply chain, perhaps in yours, how to combat it. Thanks for watching.